The frontier was built on blood and desperation, rather than on romantic vision of noble pioneers taming wilderness through courage and virtue that popular mythology celebrates. Opens by shattering myth through acknowledging that 1850s through 1880s, West was world of constant survival challenges, where death was routine outcome for settlers who made mistakes or who encountered circumstances beyond their control. The West was world of starvation when crops failed, or when game animals disappeared during seasonal migrations, leaving isolated settlers without food sources and without means of obtaining supplies from distant trading posts. Blizzards killed exposed travelers within hours through combination of hypothermia and disorientation, sudden storms transforming landscape into deadly environment, where survival required immediate shelter that often was unavailable. Predators, including wolf packs, grizzly bears, and mountain lions, attacked livestock and occasionally humans when circumstances brought them into contact, animal threats being persistent danger rather than occasional excitement that frontier populations faced regularly. Disease spread through isolated communities lacking sanitation and medical care, epidemics claiming lives when treatments were unavailable and when isolation prevented seeking help from physicians located hundreds of miles distant. Bandits and raiders attacked vulnerable wagon trains and isolated homesteads, human violence being a significant threat when law enforcement was absent and when victims could not expect rescue or justice for crimes committed in territories where government authority was nominal or non-existent. Total isolation meant that settlers faced emergencies without possibility of outside assistance, making self-reliance absolute requirement when nearest help might be weeks away by travel through dangerous territory. Settlers survived not with courage alone, though bravery was necessary, but with tactics so brutal they rarely appear in history books that prefer celebrating heroic narratives over documenting desperate measures that survival required. So brutal suggesting methods violated civilized norms and that employed violence, deception, or actions that peacetime society would condemn, but that frontier necessity made acceptable when alternative was death. They rarely appear because historians focused on noble achievements rather than on grotesque survival tactics that contradicted romantic frontier mythology, making real methods for surviving West largely invisible in popular histories, celebrating pioneers' courage while ignoring their desperation that drove them to employ tactics, revealing that West was won not through virtue but through willingness to do unthinkable when survival demanded it. When running wasn't option occurred, when settlers were caught miles from shelter on open prairie, where terrain offered no defensive positions, and where raiders' superior numbers made escape impossible. Caught in tactical situation where flight would result in being run down by mounted raiders whose horses could overtake fleeing settlers easily, making running guarantee of death rather than potential escape route. Miles from shelter meant nearest fort or settlement was too distant to reach before raiders could catch fleeing settlers. Distance, eliminating retreat as viable option when pursuers possessed mobility advantages through horses that settlers on foot or in wagons could not match. Outnumbered by raiding party whose size exceeded settlers' capacity for effective armed resistance, numerical disadvantage making conventional defense futile when ammunition was limited, and when open terrain offered no cover for defensive position. And surrounded by raiders on prairie whose flat terrain gave attackers clear observation of settlers' positions and movements, encirclement making escape impossible because every direction was blocked by raiders who could see any attempted flight. On open prairie where grass was only feature of landscape and where settlers had no natural defensive advantages except grass itself, whose combustibility would inspire desperate tactic. By raiders whose intentions were hostile and whose superior tactical position made settlers' death seem inevitable unless unconventional response could reverse tactical balance, desperation, producing innovation that conventional military thinking would not have considered. Surrounded completely meant raiders had achieved tactical envelopment that should have guaranteed their victory through allowing them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, making settlers' situation hopeless according to conventional tactical analysis that did not account for environmental factors that desperate defenders might exploit through setting prairie fire that would transform tactical situation. by creating barrier that raiders could not cross safely. The firebreak that saved lives was desperate tactic when settlers facing encirclement by raiders ignited prairie grass around their position, creating defensive barrier through fire that raiders could not cross without risking their horses and their lives. Settlers ignite grass using matches or gunpowder, starting fires in circle around their position while wind conditions allowed control of fire's direction and while grass was dry enough to burn rapidly, creating barrier before raiders could attack. Around them, in expanding circle that consumed grass fuel while leaving charred ground that would not burn again, fire creating growing zone of safety as flames moved outward from ignition points, creating circle of charred ground that served as firebreak, preventing flames from returning to burn defenders, while also creating barrier that raiders' horses would not cross when fire's heat and smoke made approach dangerous for mounted attackers. Raiders can't cross because their horses refuse to approach flames or to traverse still hot ground where hooves might be burned, animals' survival instincts preventing riders from pursuing attack across fire barrier. A terrifying tactic for defenders who risked being burned by their own fires if wind shifted or if flames moved faster than expected, making fire barrier a double-edged weapon that could kill creators as easily as it protected them from attackers. That works only once because tactic required specific conditions, including dry grass that would burn readily, wind that was strong enough to spread fire but not so strong that flames became uncontrollable, and timing that allowed completion of fire circle before raiders attacked. Only once also because raiders who had witnessed tactic would not be fooled by it again, making surprise essential for effectiveness when experienced enemies would counter through attacking before fire could be established or through waiting for fire to burn out before resuming assault. Single-use nature of tactic, making it desperate gamble that saved lives when conditions were perfect, but that could not be relied upon for repeated defense against raiders who adapted to unconventional tactics that clever settlers employed. Starvation on frontier trail was common occurrence when families on wagon trains encountered difficulties that disrupted food supplies during journeys lasting months through territories where hunting was uncertain and where supply stations were hundreds of miles apart. Families on wagon trains hit drought whose effects reduced water availability and killed grass that livestock needed for grazing, animals weakening and dying when forage was insufficient for sustaining oxen and horses pulling wagons. Sickness among travelers reduced workforce available for hunting and gathering, while simultaneously increasing nutritional needs of ill family members who could not contribute to food acquisition. Disease outbreaks, creating cascading crisis, where food shortages worsened as more people became unable to work. Dying livestock, whose deaths eliminated transportation capacity, while also removing emergency food source that desperate travelers might have slaughtered for meat. Animals' deterioration, reflecting overall supply crisis, affecting entire wagon train. Food is gone when stored provisions were exhausted, and when hunting parties returned empty-handed from territories where game had migrated seasonally or where previous wagon trains had depleted wildlife populations through overhunting. Gone completely meant families faced starvation within days, unless alternative food sources could be identified and exploited quickly before weakness from malnutrition prevented foraging or hunting activities that required physical strength. On wagon trains, whose isolation from supply sources meant that help could not arrive quickly enough to prevent starvation deaths, if families could not find food through their own efforts, making self-sufficiency absolute when nearest trading post might be weeks distant through difficult terrain. Hit multiple crises simultaneously created compound disaster where drought, sickness, and dying livestock combined to eliminate all normal food sources, forcing desperate measures that peacetime society would consider disgusting. But that frontier necessity made acceptable when alternative was watching family members starve to death during journey through wilderness, where conventional food sources had been exhausted. The venomous meal that kept them alive was rattlesnake meat that starving settlers consumed when conventional food sources were unavailable and when desperation made eating dangerous reptiles seem preferable to starvation. Settlers catch rattlesnakes through various methods, including pinning snakes with forked sticks shooting them from safe distance, or simply grabbing them when desperation overcame caution about venomous bites that could kill. Butcher them by decapitating snakes and removing heads whose venom remained dangerous even after death, then skinning bodies to access meat that was surprisingly substantial for snakes, whose muscular bodies provided protein that starving families desperately needed. And survive on meat that most modern people wouldn't touch due to cultural aversions to eating snakes whose appearance and reputation made them seem inedible, despite nutritional value that frontier settlers recognized through necessity. Most people wouldn't consider eating due to prejudices about snakes being disgusting or dangerous, their reluctance reflecting cultural conditioning rather than rational assessment of rattlesnake meat's edibility. Touch because handling snakes seemed inherently dangerous even when snakes were dead, modern aversion to snakes, making idea of eating them repulsive to people who had never faced starvation severe enough to overcome cultural taboos about consuming reptiles. That kept them alive through providing calories and protein when no other food was available, rattlesnake hunting being reliable food source in territories where snakes were common and where other game animals had disappeared or could not be caught by weakened travelers. Alive by preventing starvation that would have killed settlers within days if protein source had not been identified and exploited, snake meat's abundance in some frontier territories, making it valuable survival food, despite cultural resistance to eating reptiles that most Americans considered disgusting until hunger made squeamishness irrelevant when facing choice between eating snakes or dying from malnutrition on trails where conventional food sources had been exhausted. When water was death or salvation described frontier travelers' relationship with water, whose availability determined survival, but whose quality could kill through contamination or through poisons that made some sources deadly rather than life-sustaining. Crossing deserts where rainfall was minimal and where water sources were separated by distances exceeding human capacity for traveling without hydration, desert crossings being among most dangerous frontier journeys when miscalculations about water availability could be fatal. Where every well is dry because drought had lowered water tables below well depths or because previous travelers had exhausted limited supplies, dry wells being devastating discovery when travelers had planned on resupplying at locations that no longer contained water, poisoned by alkaline minerals, or by bacterial contamination that caused dysentery or other illnesses that could kill through dehydration that ironically resulted from drinking contaminated water whose appearance suggested it was safe. Or claimed by bandits who controlled valuable water sources and who demanded payment, or who attacked travelers attempting to access wells that outlaws had appropriated, human control of water being tactical advantage that allowed small groups to dominate larger numbers of travelers who would die without accessing water that bandits controlled. Claimed meaning that approaching water sources required risking ambush by hostile forces who used water as bait for attracting vulnerable travelers. Death or salvation depending on whether water was clean and available or whether it was absent, contaminated, or controlled by enemies, water's critical importance making its presence or absence determinative of survival during desert crossings. Salvation, when clean water was found in sufficient quantities for sustaining travelers until next source could be reached. But death, when water was unavailable or when drinking contaminated sources caused illnesses that killed through dehydration or through poisoning, that human bodies could not survive in frontier conditions where medical treatment was unavailable for travelers suffering from waterborne diseases that would have been treatable in urban environments with access to physicians. The most desperate hydration methods known were employed by frontier travelers facing death from dehydration when conventional water sources were unavailable and when survival required consuming liquids that civilized society would reject as disgusting or dangerous. Settlers drink animal blood obtained by butchering livestock or game animals, whose blood provided hydration and nutrients when water could not be found, blood drinking being practical survival technique despite cultural taboos making it seem barbaric. Muddy puddles whose water was contaminated with soil and possibly with bacteria or parasites, desperate travelers drinking turbid water that might cause illness, but that provided immediate hydration when alternative was certain death from dehydration within days. or melted snow that had been gathered from ground where animal dung was mixed with frozen precipitation, contaminated snow being melted and drunk when cleaner sources were unavailable and when immediate hydration was necessary, regardless of contamination risks. Pulled from dung piles where snow had mixed with animal waste, resulting liquid being foul but drinkable when filtered through cloth, and when desperation made concerns about contamination secondary to need for immediate fluid intake. Brutal methods that prevented dehydration through providing liquids, even when those liquids were contaminated or repulsive. Settlers' willingness to drink blood, muddy water, or dung-contaminated snow, demonstrating desperation that overruled normal hygiene standards. That prevented dehydration, which would have killed within 3 days in desert heat, brutal hydration methods, keeping travelers alive long enough to reach clean water sources that would have been unreachable if they had refused to employ desperate techniques. Methods demonstrating that frontier survival required abandoning civilized sensibilities about proper food and water when circumstances demanded consuming substances that peacetime society would reject. Settlers' survival, depending on willingness to drink whatever liquids were available, regardless of contamination or cultural taboos, when alternative was dying from thirst in territories where clean water was luxury. That, desperate circumstances did not allow when facing immediate death from dehydration, that made any liquid source valuable regardless of how disgusting its appearance or origin might be to people who had never experienced thirst severe enough to make contaminated water seem preferable to death. Winters that killed without warning struck frontier travelers when weather systems moved rapidly across plains, creating blizzards that transformed clear days into whiteout conditions within minutes. A sudden whiteout hits traveling party when cold front brought heavy snow and winds that reduced visibility to zero, weather change occurring too rapidly for travelers to reach shelter before dangerous conditions developed. Traveling party whose members were caught in open terrain when blizzard struck, their exposure to wind and snow creating life-threatening conditions immediately when temperatures dropped and when wind chill accelerated heat loss from exposed skin. Frostbite within minutes, as extreme cold and wind froze, exposed flesh rapidly, digits and facial features being damaged by ice crystal formation in tissues that occurred before travelers could protect vulnerable areas adequately. Nowhere to hide on open prairie or in mountain passes where natural shelter was absent, and where terrain offered no caves, rock overhangs, or dense timber that might have provided windbreaks or insulation from snow that was accumulating rapidly. Hide from wind whose velocity created wind chill temperatures far below actual air temperature. Convective cooling, killing through hypothermia, when body heat was stripped away by moving air that prevented warming through metabolic heat generation. Without warning, meaning travelers had no advance notice, allowing them to prepare shelter before blizzard arrived. Sudden weather changes being characteristic of frontier conditions where meteorological prediction was impossible, and where travelers relied on experience and luck for avoiding being caught in deadly storms. Killed through hypothermia that reduced core body temperature until organ function ceased. Exposure. Deaths being common among travelers who were caught without shelter during blizzards, whose severity exceeded human capacity for maintaining body heat in conditions where wet clothing and wind combined to create lethal environment. That required immediate shelter for survival beyond few hours of exposure that would exhaust body's thermal reserves and cause death from cold. Crawling into carcass to survive night was grotesque survival tactic that nevertheless saved lives when settlers facing death from exposure used dead animals' bodies as emergency shelters. Settlers gut dead bison or oxen that had died from cold or exhaustion, removing internal organs to create cavity large enough for human body, while leaving hide intact for insulation and wind protection. Or oxen whose size made them suitable for providing shelter when hollowed out, animal carcasses retaining warmth from recent death while offering protection from wind that was primary cause of heat loss during blizzard conditions, and climb inside warm cavity that had been occupied by animals' organs, human body fitting into space where intestines and other tissues had been removed to create shelter area. To avoid freezing to death when exposed humans would lose body heat faster than metabolism could replace it, Animal carcass providing insulation and windbreak that reduced heat loss enough that survival through night became possible. Through night of blizzard, whose duration exceeded what exposed humans could survive even with best clothing that frontier travelers possessed, animal shelter, making difference between death from hypothermia and survival until morning, when weather might improve or when rescue might be possible. A grotesque but life-saving tactic that violated civilized sensibilities about proper behavior, but that frontier necessity made acceptable when alternative was certain death from exposure. Settlers' willingness to enter animal carcasses demonstrating desperation that overcame revulsion. But life-saving despite grotesque nature of climbing into dead animals whose warmth and shelter prevented hypothermia, deaths that would have occurred if settlers had remained exposed during blizzards whose severity exceeded human. Thermal regulation capacity, tactics effectiveness being proven through survivors whose accounts documented using animal carcasses as emergency shelters that allowed them to survive nights that killed others who lacked shelter or who refused to employ method. That seemed too disgusting for consideration, until death from freezing made any shelter preferable to exposure that was killing through hypothermia that animal carcass insulation prevented. The frontier famine no one talks about killed settlers through starvation when wagon trains became trapped in mountains or when blizzards prevented travel for weeks, during which all food supplies were exhausted. Wagon trains stuck in mountain passes, where early snows blocked routes before travelers could complete crossings, stranded parties facing weeks or months before rescue could reach them, or before spring thaw would allow continued travel. In mountains whose elevations created severe weather that prevented escape once passes were closed by snow, altitude and cold making survival difficult even when food was available, or blizzards that lasted days or weeks preventing travel and preventing hunting that might have provided food, storms making outdoor activity impossible when visibility was zero and when temperatures were lethal for exposed humans. Run out of all food when stored provisions were exhausted, and when hunting was impossible due to weather or due to absence of game animals in mountain regions during winter when wildlife had migrated to lower elevations. All food, meaning every edible item, including items not normally considered food, had been consumed, desperate travelers eating anything organic before resorting to final desperate measure of consuming leather goods. No one talks about, because frontier famines contradicted American mythology about westward expansion being heroic adventure rather than desperate struggle, where death from starvation was real possibility that killed significant numbers of 20,000 travelers who became trapped without adequate provisions. Talks about reluctance reflecting desire to forget desperate measures that survival required, making frontier famines less visible in historical memory than romantic narratives about pioneer courage that omitted discussing starvation and cannibalism that some trapped parties resorted to when all other food sources, including leather, were exhausted. Leather consumption being desperate but not final measure that some travelers employed before resorting to consuming human remains when no other options remained. The taste of survival was boiled leather that starving settlers consumed when all conventional food sources were exhausted and when survival required eating materials not normally considered edible. Boiled belts and harnesses whose leather construction made them technically edible after prolonged boiling softened material enough that human teeth could chew it and human digestive systems could extract minimal nutrition. And harnesses made from animal hides that had been tanned for durability, but that retained enough organic material that cooking could render them consumable, leather items being last resort food that desperate travelers identified when facing starvation. Leather is boiled for hours in water that gradually softened tough material and that extracted some fat and protein from hides whose nutritional value was minimal but adequate for preventing starvation when consumed in sufficient quantities, until soft enough that teeth could tear pieces from boiled leather whose texture remained tough despite cooking, but that became chewable after prolonged boiling reduced material to consistency approaching cooked meat, and eaten like soup when leather pieces were consumed with broth that boiling had created from fats and proteins extracted from hides, resulting mixture providing calories and nutrients that kept starving travelers alive. a tactic that saved entire groups in Rockies where trapped wagon trains consumed every leather item, including boots, belts, harnesses, and saddles to avoid starving before rescue arrived or before spring thaw allowed escape. Saved lives by providing minimal nutrition that prevented death from complete starvation, boiled leather being adequate for sustaining life at subsistence level when consumed regularly, despite unpleasant taste and texture. Entire groups whose survival depended on willingness to eat materials not normally considered food, leather consumption being documented, survival tactic that multiple frontier parties employed when facing starvation in mountains where winter had trapped them without adequate conventional food supplies that would have made eating leather unnecessary if provisions had been sufficient for entire period of isolation. When ammunition and bait ran out, created crisis for frontier hunters who depended on firearms for obtaining meat and who used bait for luring predators into trap range where they could be killed safely. Hunters lose ammunition through expending bullets during hunting or through accidents that destroyed powder supplies, loss of ammunition making firearms useless and forcing reliance on traps for catching animals. Or are stuck for weeks without supplies when isolation from trading posts prevented resupplying ammunition, or when circumstances trapped hunters in territories where they could not leave until weather improved or until they recovered from injuries. Without supplies for extended period meant hunters needed methods for continuing to obtain food, despite lacking tools that normally would be employed for hunting or trapping activities. For weeks during which they needed to continue eating but lacked means of obtaining food through conventional hunting with firearms or through trapping with commercial baits that attracted predators. Ammunition and bait being essential supplies that frontier hunters normally carried but that could be lost or exhausted during extended hunting expeditions, their absence forcing improvisation using available materials for continuing to trap animals. Ran out completely, meaning hunters had no gunpowder or bullets remaining, and no commercial or prepared baits that could be used for luring predators into traps. Supply exhaustion, forcing creative solutions. Stuck, suggesting hunters could not leave territories to obtain resupply, making them dependent on whatever materials and techniques they could improvise from immediate environment for continuing to catch animals whose meat was necessary for survival during weeks or months before they could escape isolation and obtain conventional hunting supplies that would have made desperate improvisation unnecessary if resupply had been possible through traveling to trading posts that were too distant to reach, given circumstances that had trapped hunters in remote territories. The blood trail method was desperate hunting technique when settlers used drops of their own blood to lure wolves or other predators into trap range where they could be killed without expending ammunition. Settlers used drops of blood obtained by cutting fingers or hands, small wounds providing blood that could be dripped along trail, leading to trap position, where predators following scent would encounter snares or deadfalls. Of their own blood, when animal blood was unavailable because no animals had been killed recently, human blood serving same purpose as animal blood for creating scent trail that predators would follow. To lure wolves whose hunting instincts made them follow blood trails, investigating potential prey or carrion, scent being irresistible to predators whose survival depended on locating food sources. Or predators, including coyotes and mountain lions, that would investigate blood trails, hoping to find wounded animals that could be killed easily, predators' attraction to blood-making technique, effective despite requiring settlers to cut themselves. Into traps positioned at trail's end where followers would encounter snares that caught legs or deadfalls that crushed animals, traps being set before blood trail was created so predators would be caught when they followed scent. A dangerously effective last resort tactic because cutting oneself risked infection in frontier conditions where medical care was unavailable, and because attracting predators deliberately created danger if traps failed to catch. Animals that arrived expecting easy prey but that found humans instead. Effective because predators reliably followed blood trails, making technique successful for catching animals despite risks involved in its employment. Last resort characterizing methods use only when conventional hunting and trapping had failed, and when food shortage made risks acceptable compared to certain starvation if hunters could not obtain meat through any means. available, including deliberately attracting dangerous predators using human blood as bait that would lure animals into trap positions where they could be killed safely if everything worked as planned. Night attacks on open plains occurred when wagon trains were surrounded by packs of starving wolves whose hunger made them bold enough to attack humans and livestock, despite natural wariness that normally prevented wolves from approaching armed settlers. Wagon trains are surrounded by wolves that had detected livestock, whose smell attracted predators from miles distant, packs gathering around trains waiting for opportunities to attack animals that represented easy prey if wolves could separate them from human defenders. By packs of starving wolves whose desperation overcame fear of humans, winter food shortages, making wolves aggressive and willing to risk approaching armed settlers, when hunger was severe enough that predation risks seemed acceptable compared to continued starvation. Starving suggesting wolves were desperate enough that normal caution was abandoned, their behavior being more aggressive than well-fed predators would display. Too many to fight with firearms alone because pack sizes exceeded ammunition supplies and because reloading during sustained attack would create vulnerabilities that wolves would exploit, numerical superiority, making conventional defense inadequate. To fight effectively when dozens of wolves attacked simultaneously from multiple directions, firearms being too slow for engaging all threats before some wolves reached defensive perimeter. On open plains where terrain offered no defensive advantages and where wagons provided only protection available for settlers facing pack attacks that would continue through night until wolves were driven away or until they succeeded in killing livestock or humans. Surrounded completely meant retreat was impossible and meant defensive position was fixed at wagon circle, where settlers would make stand using all available weapons and tactics for defending against predators whose numbers made victory. Uncertain if conventional weapons were only defense employed against sustained pack attacks that would test defenders' ammunition supplies and endurance through hours of darkness when visibility was limited and when wolves could approach without being seen until they were close enough to attack defensive positions. The defensive firing was desperate tactic, when settlers facing wolf pack attacks burned their own property to create barrier that predators would not cross. Settlers burn wagons that provided transportation and shelter, sacrificing irreplaceable vehicles to create flames that would deter wolf approaches during night, when attacks were most dangerous. Furniture that families had carried west as household goods was consigned to flames that created defensive perimeter, burning personal property, demonstrating desperation when survival required destroying possessions that represented families' wealth. And supplies, including food containers and equipment, were burned to maintain flames through night, settlers accepting future hardship from supply loss in exchange for immediate survival against wolf attacks. To create defensive circle of flames surrounding wagon train position, where families and livestock sheltered behind fire barrier that wolves' instincts prevented them from crossing. Circle of fire whose heat and light deterred predators whose fear of flames was stronger than hunger that had driven them to attack human settlement. Fire being effective wolf deterrent despite requiring sacrifice of property. Sacrificing everything to survive night when wolf attacks might kill livestock and humans if defenses were inadequate, settlers' willingness to burn their possessions, demonstrating calculation that lives were more valuable than property. To survive single night's attacks meant accepting poverty afterward, when burned wagons and supplies could not be replaced easily in frontier territories where purchasing replacements required traveling to distant trading posts, sacrifice being necessary but devastating for families whose survival west of settlements depended on equipment and supplies that fire defense had consumed, making defensive firing tactic that saved lives immediately, but that created future hardships through destroying property, that frontier travel required for success in reaching destinations and establishing new settlements in territories, where replaced equipment was unavailable or prohibitively expensive for impoverished settlers who had burned their possessions to survive wolf attacks. The frontier's most brutal journeys occurred when settlers were stranded miles from destinations and were forced to continue on foot after losing transportation that had carried them across plains and mountains. Settlers stranded with dead livestock whose deaths eliminated pulling power for wagons that could not be moved by human strength alone, animal losses forcing abandonment of vehicles and most possessions, or broken wagons whose axles or wheels had failed from rough terrain or from accidents, mechanical failures making vehicles immobile when repairs were impossible due to lack of materials or tools for fixing broken components. Must continue on foot when remaining at broken wagon site meant certain death from exposure or starvation, and when walking toward destinations offered only chance for survival, despite distances that would test human endurance. On foot through territories where wagon travel was difficult, walking being far more challenging when settlers lacked proper footwear for sustained hiking, and when they needed to carry minimal supplies and children during forced marches toward distant destinations. Continue despite exhaustion and despite injuries that walking would worsen, settlers' determination to reach safety, overcoming physical limitations that would have stopped less motivated travelers. Most brutal because forced marches after wagon failures combined exhaustion from previous travel with new hardships of walking dozens of miles while carrying children and essential supplies, cumulative suffering exceeding what either stage would have imposed separately. Journeys whose brutality resulted from unplanned nature of foot travel that began after disasters rather than being chosen deliberately, settlers being unprepared for walking long distances when they had expected to ride in wagons that mechanical failures or animal deaths had made unusable, forcing continuation on foot through territories where distances exceeded comfortable walking range and where terrain made every mile, exhausting struggle that tested settlers' physical capabilities and determination to survive when turning back was impossible, and when only option was continuing forward despite suffering that walking would impose on unprepared travelers. Wrapping feet in rag and rawhide was improvised footwear technique that settlers employed when shoes wore out during forced marches across frontier territories whose rough terrain destroyed conventional footwear rapidly. They walked dozens of miles with bleeding feet whose skin had been abraded by walking without adequate protection, open wounds making every step painful, but settlers continuing despite injuries. Cracked skin whose dryness and mechanical stress had created fissures that bled and that provided entry points for infections, foot damage accumulating during days of walking. Swollen from inflammation caused by repeated trauma and by infections that developed in damaged tissues. Swelling making walking more difficult, but not preventing continued progress toward destinations. Feet wrapped in makeshift bindings consisting of cloth torn from clothing and rawhide cut from leather goods or from dead animals, improvised footwear providing minimal protection but being better than walking completely barefoot, in rag that absorbed some blood and that provided thin barrier between damaged skin and ground, cloth wrapping offering cushioning despite inadequate durability. And rawhide whose toughness provided better protection than cloth alone, but that required moisture for remaining flexible, dried rawhide being rigid and uncomfortable but effective for preventing further damage to feet. A brutal tactic of pure endurance when settlers walked despite pain and damage to feet that would have stopped less determined travelers, their progress depending on willingness to continue moving despite injuries. Pure endurance without special skills or equipment, beyond improvisational ability to create minimal foot protection from available materials, settlers' survival depending on psychological determination to continue walking despite physical suffering that made every step agonizing test of will. Of endurance that allowed covering dozens of miles on damaged feet, whose condition deteriorated daily, but that remained functional enough for walking when alternative was remaining stranded in territories where death from exposure. Starvation was certain if settlers stopped moving before reaching destinations that represented only chance for survival, through completing journeys that physical conditions suggested should have been impossible on bleeding, swollen feet, wrapped in rags that provided inadequate protection. The West was won by people who refused to die despite facing circumstances that killed most settlers who encountered comparable hardships without employing desperate survival tactics. Closes with theme acknowledging that frontier wasn't conquered by mythic heroes whose virtue and courage overcame obstacles through noble means, popular mythology being false when examining actual methods that survival required. By mythic heroes, but was survived by desperate settlers who employed tactics that desperation rather than planning produced, their survival methods being improvised responses to immediate threats rather than being applications of learned techniques. Using tactics born of starvation when complete absence of food forced consumption of materials not normally considered edible. Leather and snakes becoming food sources when conventional options were exhausted. Terror when facing predator attacks or hostile forces whose numbers exceeded settlers' capacity for conventional defense. Desperate tactics like burning prairie or sacrificing wagons being employed when fear of death overcame concerns about future consequences. And unbreakable will that sustained continued effort when physical suffering suggested stopping. Psychological determination being essential factor, allowing settlers to persist despite pain and exhaustion that would have stopped less motivated people. These 8 brutal methods reveal real frontier being place where survival required abandoning civilized sensibilities and employing tactics that peacetime society would condemn, frontier necessity, making acceptable what normal circumstances would reject. A place where you lived only if you were willing to do unthinkable when circumstances demanded actions that violated cultural norms or moral principles. Settlers' survival depending on willingness to burn property, eat disgusting foods, inflict wounds on themselves, or employ violence exceeding what civilized warfare allowed, making frontier success dependent on abandoning inhibitions about proper behavior and accepting that survival sometimes required doing things that would be unforgivable in peacetime, but that frontier desperation made necessary when alternative was death from starvation, exposure, or violence in territories where help was unavailable and where self-reliance was absolute. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.